Many Zelda games are considered legends if you'll pardon the pun. From the original to Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time and even Breath of the Wild, there are titles that transform the franchise in some massive ways. Some were even neat little experiments like Majora's Mask, and then there were failures like the ones on CDI. However, it's not always necessary to reinvent the wheel, there's merit in refining what you've already got. With that in mind, I think Twilight Princess deserves a little credit here. Given that it was remade or remastered depending on who's asking on the Wii U, you might say the wheel was refined twice over. Let's see if all that refining did it any good. Here's my review of The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess HD Edition for the Wii U. The idea that Twilight Princess is a refinery of previous Zelda games rather than a reinvented game is perhaps best seen in the gameplay. That's not to say there aren't plenty of new concepts, there are new types of items, and Wolf Link is certainly unlike anything else seen in Zelda before. One of the earliest examples of it taking things to the next level is in Link's Blade. Far from the N64 and Wind Waker, Link can now swing his sword while moving. It especially helps when you want to cut the grass in pursuit of rubies and other items. You can also use your sword on Epona, giving you options for horse combat aside from just using your bow. Since Link starts out grown from the start, you end up getting both the slingshot and bow and arrow, and the latter especially making the former obsolete a little bit. Even some older items are breathed new life into, such as the iron boots now being utilized for far more than just sinking. While the Zora armor allows you to freely swim, so they're not strictly required for that anymore, it does allow you to walk and open things like chests and doors. No longer being required for swimming is also more than compensated by being utilized to best Gorons in combat, in addition to their magnetic properties being used to pull Link to walls and ceilings. It's certainly a very unique way to use an item you probably thought you had all figured out. Another great example is the hook shot, now known as the claw shot in this game. You end up getting a second one and are able to zip around points like you're Spider-Man, Spider-Man. The game is all too happy to emphasize this feeling of flight with flying plant creatures you can latch across. Both of these concepts would be reused in Skyward Sword, so clearly they knew they were onto something. Another old item you get back in a new light is the fishing rod. While Ocarina of Time had a fishing minigame, you can now fish wherever you want. It's a simple pull rod, but it's handy if you just want to catch skeleton fish in a dungeon. Those aren't registered, of course, it's just for fun. One part of the game actually requires you to use it to get the scent of a red snapper. You can bottle bee larvae to help your catches. You can also go to a fishing hole in the game to get a more traditional reel rod, serving the same as Ocarina of Time's minigame with the addition of a boat you can row around in. Perhaps one criticism is that some of the more original items can be key items rather than especially useful. The spinner can be seen as this, but you can technically use it in combat. It's just inefficient since it doesn't go very far without a rail. This complaint is best seen in the Dominion Rod, however. It controls robotic shells, and that's literally it. If there isn't something metal with an orb-sized hole in it, you're just throwing a light ball around. At least the ball of chain is pretty fun to swing around, even if it's another not quite so practical weapon. One pretty neat addition though is the Gale Boomerang. Far from the common boomerang in previous games, a powerful twister accompanies each swing. It can knock enemies around, which is especially handy when you're in the City of the Sky and just want to give your enemies a nice fall. Naturally, the forest temple you get it in makes the heaviest use of it, but it's a good general use for different situations. The bow and arrow likewise can be fitted with bombs or combined with a Hawkeye for sniping. As mentioned prior, the Zora armor allows you to swim in addition to letting you breathe down under. While it's quite slow compared to Zora Link on Majora's Mask, it's at least a lot faster than the Ocarina of Time method of sinking and walking. Magic armor makes a return from Wind Waker, but the lack of a magic meter means it now runs on rupees. Given the huge price sink just to get the armor, this thing is going to cut a gaping hole in your wallet in no time. Using it without rupees turns it into functionless iron boots, providing no protection and all-around slowdown. The lack of magic meter also causes Ferrari's Wind to be replaced with a slightly disturbing Uko and her equally disturbing Sun to teleport to and from a dungeon to the room you left. Another return from Wind Waker, of course, is sword techniques. Finding certain stone structures and then the accompanying Gold Wolf causes you to appear before Hero Shade, who teaches you all manners of techniques. One, known as Mortal Draw, is actually quite powerful and allows you to one-shot the Snow Peak Ruins' mini-boss. Of course, how can I talk about the gameplay without Wolf Link? You can run, dash, and jump bite enemies. Contrary to prior games as companions, Midna provides more than just info. You can use her Shadow Hand to make a circle around enemies. Letting go causes Wolf Link to rip at all enemies in the circle. This is actually necessary to finish off Shadow Beasts in Wolf Link form, as leaving just one standing causes it to revive the others. Wolf Link also allows you to use teleportation warps, and after you get the Master Sword, you can use them whenever you want. You just can't transform back and forth in front of other people, perhaps justifiably so. You also have a scent mechanic, although only one at a time, and you can dig in specific areas. The game will also prompt you when you can use Midna to help you jump to new heights. She doesn't seem to actually do anything, so I imagine Wolf Link just becomes motivated to reach her to teach her a lesson. The small and boss keys function as normal, and the mini-bosses and bosses are also pretty standard fare. The Water Temple continues to be the most confusing of the dungeons, but it wasn't too bad. It was basically redirecting the flow like in Majora's Mask. The Snow Peak Ruins is the most unique, with each item progression cleverly disguised as Yetta forgetting where the boss key is. Instead, you unwittingly fetch ingredients for Yeto, who strong-arms them from Link to add to his soup. At least he's cool with you filling your bottles with the increasingly potent soup. At its peak, it's basically a red potion, which is pretty good for a freebie, and it even looks like Estus Flask, which fit well with me when I was live streaming it. Ultimately, Twilight Princess delivers just fine on gameplay. The lack of magic meter means they had to find some creative workarounds, and it's obvious that it was later in development due to a screenshot and a useless green choo-choo jelly left behind. Still, the game does shine as a whole and provides enough polish with some new concepts to be very fun. One of my criticisms with the original being a bit too easy is definitely largely addressed in Hero Mode. It actually served as quite a challenge by Zelda standards, especially those two optional cave areas. All in all, it very much succeeds on a gameplay standpoint. You know the drill by now. Spoiler alert, presentation is in the timestamps and will be coming for you if you ignore this warning. Ooh, spooky vague warning! Moving on. Let's not beat around the bush here, there are some elements a bit similar to Ocarina of Time. You start out in a forest and go through a pretty similar themed temple. Then you go through the Gorons in their temple, the Zoras in their temple, then proceed to the Master Sword. You even end up taking out Ganondorf. However, I think it's unfair to judge it solely based off that. After all, I'd argue that Ocarina of Time copies Link to the Past far more than Twilight Princess copies Ocarina of Time. For starters, instead of rescuing sages in the later act, you assemble shards of a mirror. Twilight Princess also incorporates a few elements from A Link to the Past that Ocarina of Time doesn't, such as having the Master Sword in the forest and making the Twilight Realm more closely related to the Dark World. Of course, and we can't forget about the most significant distinguishing factor, a companion character who's actually compelling and in-depth. No hate for Navi, but she's basically the designated companion with barely a shred of personality, while Midna has her own ambitions that are even questionable at first. The spirits even warn you about the shadow power she's seeking, making it seem like Midna's really up to no good and might even turn on you. Until Zelda's sacrifice, Midna only really cared about reclaiming her throne and was indifferent to the Light World's plight. It was really nice seeing her make that change, not to mention nail-bitingly tense just prior with Midna's dying and you're racing just to get to Zelda. This betrayal of Link is also an interesting one. Of all the potential interests for Link in Ocarina of Time, I saw him being with Malon the most since Link's a simple man. The ranch life seemed to fit him. Nintendo must have agreed, since while that Link's choice of partner is vague, this one starts out as a rancher. All that physical activity must have done wonders for his fitness too, because he's arguably the physically strongest Link apart from maybe Breath of the Wild. He's able to subdue goats and with only iron boots was able to successfully fend off Gorons with his bare hands. Unlike other Links, he never gets anything to actually enhance his physical strength. He even swings a massive metal ball and chain around like it's nothing. Speaking of the Ocarina of Time Link, or at least the timeline shared by this and Majora's Mask, he technically shows up too. The game just doesn't make it clear because he's a skeletal knight known as the Hero's Shade. It seems Breath of the Wild and Skyward Sword aren't the only ones to have Link become a knight. He's also technically the most talkative Link of the mainline games, not counting the terrible CDI games and cartoons, so the only really canon example. The concept of a previous generation of Link guiding the current one is interesting, and it would be cool to see an older, scruffier Link serving as a mentor figure. Another plus is that they finally addressed Zora's domain being frozen solid, as Midna's convenient Twilight powers utilize a super hot rock to make short work of it. Guess it's a good thing they don't suffer hibernation sickness nor shock from the sudden increase in temperature, but it's magic, so just roll with it. I also like how many of the NPCs are portrayed, like Link's love interest Ilia and the kids. Obviously, Colin is the star among them since he has the hero's journey in his own right. That toddler-looking character, though, is quite devious, but at least he doesn't want to conquer the world. He just wants to conquer the business world, which is at least a far less bloody form of world domination. A hero's group is even seen throughout the game, assisting Link in little ways like getting to the mirror shards and getting a crowning moment of awesome in Hyrule Castle, so that's a plus. Link need not do everything alone, and it's good to see that there are other competent characters out there. Twilight Princess's portrayal of Zelda is also perhaps the best one up to this point. She's far from being actively involved, but she is forced into difficult decisions. What Midna mistakes as weakness from her surrender was actually strength. She swallowed her pride to prevent any more unnecessary loss of life. When she doesn't hesitate to sacrifice her own protection to save Midna's life, she proves that being good with a sword isn't the only kind of strength. This is the most regal representation of Zelda, which is fitting because she was about to be crowned queen in this one. Maybe one day we can get over the evil queen trope and give her the title she deserves. Frozen can do it, and Disney basically invented the evil queen trope in animated movies, so Zelda can too. Yeto and Yetta also show real consequences on the part of the Mirror Shards and the Twilight Forces as a whole. Having her fall ill and then becoming possessed really shows what's at stake, and it gives it weight. The other two shards end up falling short in comparison, but only because they don't involve possession. They're cool in their own right, with Aragon providing a comedic moment, but it can't compare to having to fight such a gentle-hearted Yeti. Perhaps the only other major nitpick is the hijacked plot. I'm not completely against it, but I can see why others would be, and they make it pretty obvious once Ganondorf starts being discussed. So, of course, he was the one who gave Zan his power, and of course he'd be the secret main villain. At least we get one really cool moment where Zan somehow is the one to finish him off in the end. I just assumed they had some kind of life connection that Zan used to end his life, but one theory actually involves him having a hand on the Triforce of Power. Ganondorf even dies on his feet like a real boss, if you'll pardon the pun. Overall, I have to say Twilight Princess has a very serviceable plot. While it follows a bit of a formula and the plot hijack was a bit too predictable, it was also a wild ride from start to finish. From the initial pull into the Twilight Realm to Ilia's memory loss to the wacky cannon into the city in the sky, there's plenty of twists and turns. Even if Zant would suffer a villainous breakdown later on, his initial encounters do an excellent job making him appear unbreakable or even just unstoppable. Midna is one of the best additions to Zelda period, and Princess Zelda and a variety of other NPCs are very well portrayed indeed. Seeing Midna's true form was also a nice payoff, showcasing that she's truly restored to her former glory. There's so much to love about this story that it overpowers any scrutiny and stands as one of the better Zelda plots if you ask me. Since the N64 was much weaker and later Zelda games would favor a more cartoony style, Twilight Princess is certainly the most cinematic in a way. It's even more impressive that the game originally released on GameCube, although that version really shows its age with low-resolution textures. This is where the Wii U version comes into play. While the character models don't appear to have been altered much if at all, it's hardly just a resolution bump here. The world textures are very noticeably improved in quality, improving the most poorly aged part of that version while retaining all the charm. Not counting the Wii U demo that went nowhere, this is as close as we're going to get to a realistic HD Zelda, at least for now. I'm not against the cartoony style. Breath of the Wild is quite beautiful in its own way, but it would be nice to see a Zelda game that pushes the Switch in a realistic tone. Or better yet, whatever next system Nintendo comes out with. While Twilight Princess itself is the closest to realistic for Zelda, it's not photorealistic by any means either. It takes a stylistic direction, with many of the NPCs described as weird looking. At least the most important ones like Link and Zelda look just fine. It's mostly some villagers that can look a bit off. Midna has a very nice mischievous quality to her imp design, and while I'm avoiding spoilers in this specific portion, her true form contrasts that nicely. You can check out the plot section if you want to see it for yourself. The environments are the real star of the show, showcasing various beautiful environments of different kinds. From the lush green of the starting forest to the beautiful blue waters of Lake Hylia or the molten hot Death Mountain, there's plenty of variety here. The Snow Peak Mountains not only show off some nice snow, but there's some impressive by GameCube standards reflections going on in the ice. It even factors into the boss fight since you use the reflections to avoid an attack with. The Twilight Realm can almost amusingly be described as a next-gen filter. I say this because it's a muted yellowish hue with some aggressive bloom. It's nothing truly eye-straining unless you have some very sensitive eyes, but it's not the most visually pleasing thing in the game either. Then again, maybe looking oppressive is the whole point. The Twilight creatures and black squares flying about are interesting though, and the actual Twilight Palace shows a much more aesthetically appealing part of the realm. The music in the game is quite good, having some of the best music in Zelda in my opinion. Midna's Lament and Blizetta's theme are especially powerful, with the latter defying a standard seen in the other boss fights. With the other bosses, a very unique track plays when the boss is stunned and vulnerable to attack. It's very frantic and exciting, but Nintendo must have realized it wouldn't do for the tragic-sounding Blizzetta theme. Instead, it has its own remix of the boss stun theme that's just as tragic as the rest of the piece and with the same instruments as the rest of Blizzetta's music. Hyrule Castle is another noteworthy one. It starts out with the Link to the Past castle music. As you make your way up, though, Ganondorf's theme slowly creeps into the castle music until it's completely engulfed it, almost like Ganondorf having slowly taken over the castle. One noteworthy thing is it sort of has voice acting. Or rather, Midna has what sounds like Simlish, which is apparently just English vocalization scrambled. It's actually kinda cute when it's put back together.
Jungle running off.
Other than her, though, the game still uses text dialogue, although there are voice samples to get an idea of how they sound. Sound effects are there, of course. Interestingly, the Wii version used some sound effects in its low-quality microphone, but this is the Wii U version, so it doesn't have that. In short, the presentation is overall quite good. While it would be nice to see a realistic-styled Zelda game built from the ground up for an HD system, this gets the job done. The texture is the worst aged aspect of the GameCube and Wii versions apart from resolution on native hardware and bumped up nicely, and everything else is retained nicely too. It could be a lot better, especially in terms of polygon counts, but at least it's improved enough that it doesn't look half bad in HD. Twilight Princess looks and sounds better than ever and really shows how cinematic and beautiful a Zelda game can be even when it's not being deliberately cartoony. Twilight Princess isn't the most original Zelda game, let's just throw it out there. It has some very original elements, it's not a straight-up clone, but it's clearly less about innovating and more about refining and polishing. Thankfully, it does that fairly well. The new and old blend together well enough to create a very good game despite its shortcomings. The Wii U version, while hardly the remake of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask for the 3DS, do help add enough to bring out its shine. If you can look past the faults and somewhat familiar beats, it still has a lot to offer. This has been my review of Twilight Princess HD. Thank you so much for tuning in with me. Subscribe and attack that bell icon to keep notified. A like always helps, and I'll see you next time. This week's epic freebie until the following Thursday is Europa Universalis 4. Now capitalize on life and have a nice day.